Blocking, as we said back in part 1, uses the ST strength stat, and players with a higher strength are better at blocking. So 3 is our benchmark value on the human lineman. Players lower or higher than that are a bit out of the ordinary and bad or good at blocking respectively. So when you activate a player who becomes the attacker for the block and you declare a block action, you also need to declare a target who's the defender for the block. So this needs to be an opposing player that's standing in your player's tackle zone at the beginning of their activation. So we'll go back to our zombie and lineman that we used in earlier examples. So here I activate my lineman, I declare a block action, and I declare this zombie as the target. Next thing to do is to compare the strength value of the 2 players. We know that the human lineman is strength 3 because he's Mr. Average. The zombie is also strength 3. So now we get our sort of first statement of truth about blocks, I suppose you could say. But the first one is that when there's a block where both players are of equal strength, you roll 1 block dice and you apply the result. So now we'll look at the actual block dice in just a minute, and we'll see that this 1 dice block is actually quite risky. So it's now the undead team's turn, and they have this mummy marked by another human lineman. The lineman has strength 3, but the mummy has strength 5, which is of course higher. So our second statement: when there's a block where 1 player is stronger, you roll 2 block dice, and the stronger player chooses which result is applied. One more before we look at the dice themselves. Later in the undead turn, the other mummy is blocked. Is not blocked. Is marked by a catcher from the human team. So the mummy activates to block the catcher. The mummy is strength 5, and the catcher is only strength 2. So our third and final one: when there's a block where 1 player's strength is more than double the opponent's, you roll 3 block dice, and the stronger player chooses the result. This is specifically more than double. So if it's a strength 4 player blocking a catcher, it's only double strength 2, so it'll just be a 2 dice block. So you can see where stronger players get advantage on blocks because they're getting to choose the result from a rolled dice pool. And it doesn't matter whose turn it is. If the catcher wants to block the mummy in the human's turn, it's still 3 block dice and the mummy's choosing, but that's incredibly risky and you probably wouldn't make a move like that. So I've got a few block dice out, and these are just sitting on the table. So we can look at the various results we can roll. We'll also, for the first time in these guides, look at some of the skills that players have. There are 3 that we're going to look at that have particular effects on the block dice themselves. So if you're playing tabletop and you don't have a set of block dice with these symbols on, you can sort of fudge this with d6 rolls, but I would recommend sourcing a set of dice and sort of using those. It will help your game run a bit smoother. But I'd sort of number these 1 to 6 from left to right here, and that's the sort of the translation, if you like, of those. But just using the block dice themselves, getting the hang of what these symbols mean, will be a better experience, I think, all round. So there are 6 sides on a block dice, only 5 different symbols because there are 2 sides with this arrow on. And we'll start with the worst result, which is the skull. So a 1 if you're translating it to a d6. And skulls are what nobody wants to see when they're rolling a block dice. It means the attacker, so the active player taking the block action, is knocked down. So this means they risk injury, and it's also a turnover. So this result, 2 on a d6, if you're doing that, is both down. As you've probably guessed, that means both players are knocked over. So this, like the skull, also causes a turnover for the active team, but it's both players that might be hurt because they're both knocked over. So results 3 and 4, the 2 arrows, these mean the attacking player pushes the defender back 1 square. The attacker chooses which square the defender is moved to, but it's always one of the 3 squares behind them and opposite the attacker. So if the players are square to one another, it's this straight line of 3 squares behind the defender, and if the block's on the diagonal like this, it's this sort of L shape behind them there. It's the three squares furthest away on the other side. The attacking player can then choose whether or not they're going to follow up into the space vacated by the defender for the block. But they follow up into that same square. They don't get to follow up anywhere else just to keep contact. It's specifically that square. So these final 2, so the results for 5 and 6, called Defender Stumbles, this one, and Defender Down. They're sometimes called POWs, and they're what you're really looking for when you throw blocks. We'll come to the difference between the 2 in a minute when we look at some skills. But in both cases, the defender is pushed back, just like with the arrows, with all the same options, but they're also knocked over with a risk of being hurt. So the attacker can follow up, like with a push, but they have to decide whether or not they're going to do that before any dice are rolled for injuries. So I said a little while ago that the lineman throwing the 1 dice block against the zombie is a risky move, and it is. There's a 1 in 3 chance of a turnover when you do that. So if you're stuck with either of these, your players is going to go down for a turnover. You do also, though, have a 1 in 3 chance to safely knock the zombie over too, so there'll be times when that's maybe worth the risk. But let's look at our first skill, which is a skill that both Whites and Blitzers on the human team have. It's a skill called Block. And this is a very core skill in the game that a lot of players have. And Block makes the Block skill makes the Block actions much safer. And what it does is it affects the both down result. Any player who takes a both down, whether they're the attacker or the defender, is not knocked over or a both down if they have the Block skill. So if we replace this lineman with a Blitzer, who's going to make that block instead, the chance of a turnover reduces from 1 in 3 for either of these coming up to a 1 in 6, which is a massive difference because it's only the skull that players with Block need to worry about. Another skill to mention at this point is Wrestle. So this also affects that both down result. If a Wrestle player chooses to use their skill, both players are placed prone, even if one of them has Block. So it sort of overrides Block in a way. What it doesn't do, though, is risk injury to either player because it's sort of a controlled fall. And it also doesn't cause a turnover. You just sort of lay both players down. So if we say, for argument's sake, that the zombie had the Wrestle skill, they don't start with it, but they could pick it up later. And the Blitzer throws that block with 1 dice. That's the result that comes up. The zombie could just get knocked over and the Blitzer doesn't, or they could choose to use Wrestle, in which case both of the players are going to go down, but neither of them will be hurt. And that doesn't cause a turnover for the Blitzer because it hasn't been knocked over. He's just been placed prone, and being knocked down and being placed prone are distinctly different things. One way it would cause a turnover is if the active player, so the Blitzer in that case, was carrying the ball when they went down, because if you're placed prone, you drop the ball, and losing possession of the ball is always bad. So there's nobody in either of these teams that starts with the Wrestle skill. In fact, the only players in the entire game that actually start with Wrestle are the Imperial Nobility bodyguards. So if you've got the second season box set, you'll have a team of Imperial Nobility, and 4 of the players are bodyguards with Wrestle. But most, if not probably all teams really, will benefit with some Wrestle sort of splashed in among their skills as they develop, and it's really handy for knocking over players with Block. So the difference between the defender stumbles and defender down is down to a skill, which is dodge. So human catchers and halflings, we don't have a halfling on the pitch actually, but yeah, catchers and halflings plus ghouls on the undead team, they all start with the dodge skill, and it's a skill that turns up a lot on many teams, both sort of as a starting skill, and it's one that gets picked up as players improve as well. It's a very popular one because it's good and it's effective. But what it does in this case is that if the defender has dodge, it turns this defender stumbles result, the one with the exclamation mark in, that becomes a pushback instead of a knockdown. So it keeps them on their feet more, and it makes them quite a bit harder to knock over. So we go back to smooth these out of the way. We set up a 1 dice block with a human lineman against a ghoul. And we'll look at the chances here. It's still 1 dice because they're both strength 3, and it's still at 1 in 3 chance of a turnover from the lineman if either of these come up. But to safely knock over the ghoul, that's reduced from 1 in 3 for both of these to 1 in 6, because this is the only one that's going to do it. Because the dodge skill makes this a pushback instead of a knockdown. It makes the ghoul much harder to knock over. Rolling more block dice, we're sort of going back to block for this, but rolling more block dice is safer than rolling 1 dice with a skill. So a 1 dice block, if the attacker has block, like with the Blitzer against the mummy, it's a 1 in 6 turnover chance with the skull. But the mummy blocking the lineman here, it's only a 1 in 9 turnover chance, even though the mummy doesn't have block. So the chance of both of these, so you're rolling 2 dice and them both being from these, the chances of that is 1 in 9. So it's longer odds, and you're more likely to stay up doing that with 2 dice. If the Blitzer gets to roll 2 dice with block, the turnover chance is reduced to a tiny 1 in 36 because it's only double skulls that's going to cause a turnover. To get extra block dice though, the Blitzer's going to need some help from his teammates, and that's the next thing we're going to look at. Right, so this is probably the most complicated bit of the rules for a new player. I've seen new players really struggle to grasp this and for it to take a while to go in. But it's really important for blocking, so let's tackle it now. So take the human Blitzer here, and we'll have him block the zombie, because they're, like we said, they're the same strength. So 1 dice block for that 1 in 6 chance of failure. To get an extra block dice, we need to give the Blitzer an assist, which we can do by having a lineman come in and give an assist. It can be any friendly player. So the lineman comes in to mark the zombie as well, and that gives an assist on the block. So an assist on a block gives +1 strength to all to players involved in the block. So here, the Blitzer is blocking the zombie with 1 strength, and that makes the Blitzer strength 4, which is higher than the zombie's 3, and that means there are 2 block dice rolled and the Blitzer chooses the result. But assists work for both teams as well, and in both terms. So if this mummy was standing here, and the catcher is, let's put him there, they can both provide an assist for the block, because they're both marking the opposing player that's involved in the block. The lineman and the catcher are marking the zombie, and the mummy is marking the Blitzer. It doesn't matter what the assisting player's relative strength values are, so the strength 2 catcher and the strength 5 mummy are both adding the same value to this particular block. They'd always just add +1. So the Blitzer with 2 assists is strength 5, and the zombie with 1 assist is strength 4. So it's a 2 block dice, and the humans choose the result. Now the complicated bit about assists is this. The player trying to assist can only be marking the opponent that's involved in the block, so they have to be free to do that without other players interfering. So if we put a second lineman in here, it's going to prevent the mummy from assisting the zombie, and it would only have strength 3. So if the mummy is marked by another player, it can't give an assist. And let's grab a ghoul. If this ghoul was here, move that lineman out of the way. If the ghoul is here, neither the lineman nor the catcher can assist, because the ghoul's marking both of them. It doesn't matter about numbers in this case. If these players are marked by another player, they can't assist. An assisting player has to be in the tackle zone of the opponent, but not in any other opposing player's tackle zone. So if they're marked by another player, they can't assist. Now, one of the good things about skills in this game, and actually this comes up in a lot of games I think, where there's some sort of ability or skill that provides an exception to the rule, it can sometimes help you to understand what the rule does in the first place. And a skill that makes an exception to the assisting and block rules is one called guard, which is a really sought after skill, and you'll start to see it a lot as teams develop. There aren't any players in the game that start with it as a starting skill, but loads of them will pick it up as the team develops. So if we were to give this mummy guard, actually I'll just put it on, shouldn't be that hard to find, and give the mummy guard, which is quite a common sight in an undead team. And it can now assist on this block, because the exception that guard provides is that it allows a player to assist the block even if they're marked by another player. So in this situation, it doesn't matter that the lineman is here or how many other humans are marking this mummy. The humans can't stop the mummy from providing an assist unless they push it, knock it over or push it away, which isn't easy. And that means the mummy is there providing an assist, and the zombie has strength 4 against the Blitzer's 3 in this current situation. So the Blitzer can still throw that 2 dice block, but because the zombie's stronger, the undead are going to get to choose a result that's used, which is risky for the humans, because if one of these comes up, it's a turnover. They're probably only going to do that if they're desperate to move this zombie. And what they probably need to do is try and move this ghoul out of the way first, somehow, maybe by using another player. And that's going to free up both of these assists, and it gives the strength advantage back to the Blitzer with 2 assists to 1. Guard works on both turns though, so if the humans don't do anything about this ghoul, the zombie is still going to have a 2 dice block on the Blitzer, because it's strength 3, 4 with that assist, which it doesn't matter about that because of guard against the Blitzer's 3 because he's got no assists. Like I said, that understanding assisted blocks is probably like the most complicated and fiddly part of the game mechanics, and it all sort of comes down to having that fundamental understanding about how tackle zones work and marking players. And getting familiar with this and sort of working out how to maximise blocks to your advantage is a key skill for learning how to get some success out of the game. So this section on assisting blocks is going to be timestamped below. So if you've not taken that in, maybe go back, like have another watch until you've got it clear. Like watch it as many times as you need to. It's, like I said, the most complicated bit for starting players to work out how that works. And you might have even watched that and think, oh yeah, that sounds pretty simple. But when you actually get onto the pitch of a team, you start seeing different shapes. It can be a bit confusing. It can take a little while to get used to. But if you can get that, I don't think anything else in the game will cause you any problems. One of the special actions that you can take just once every turn is the Blitz. So this is an important and valuable action. Choosing carefully where you use it each turn is probably quite an essential part of planning your turn. You only get one every turn, so it's important to consider where it's going to be most effective. So a Blitz is a combination of a move and a block action, the two actions we've looked at so far, and it allows one player on your team to take both actions in one turn. So the block can be at any point in the player's movement, including the beginning or the end, or anywhere in between, but you have to declare the target of the Blitz when you declare the action. Making the block sort of costs 1 square of the player's MA, and you can make a rush for this if you need to. So if this white here wants to blitz this catcher, it can move the 6 squares up to it, and then it can throw a d6 to try to score 2+ for the GFI, and then make the 2 dice block because it's higher strength than the catcher. After the block is resolved, maybe you just get a pushback. The white can then rush 1 more square if it wants to, and combine that into a move. It's also important that you declare the Blitz action as soon as you activate a player who's going to do it. There are some circumstances where you can lose a player's activation, and it's important to know what action they're going to take when you do that. So an example is the Ogre on the human team. So the Ogre has a trait called Bonehead, and this has to be rolled every time the Ogre activates, and it gives them a 1 in 6 chance of losing their activation, and also incidentally their tackle zone, until they pass a future Bonehead test. So if you were going to blitz with the Ogre, you'd lose it if you failed this Bonehead roll. So you can't wait until you pass Bonehead to use your blitz with the Ogre. So the sort of process becomes activate the Ogre, declare the blitz and the target. So you say like the Ogre's going to blitz the Ghoul, then you roll Bonehead. Then you roll Bonehead. You can't wait until you pass Bonehead to choose to use your blitz. If you pass that Bonehead test, which is a 2+ d6 roll every turn, you get to go blitz the Ogre, blitz the Ghoul. If you fail that test though, the Ogre stands still, loses its tackle zone, but you also lose your blitz for the turn. You don't get to do that again with another player. When you push back a defender with a block, whether they're knocked over or not, you may have a situation where all of the squares they can be pushed to are filled with other players. When this happens, you have to push back another player to make space for the defender to move into. The attacker chooses which player is chain pushed and which square they're moved to. So to show visually, we've got a couple of situations set up here where this might be the case. Firstly, we've got this blitzer is pushing this zombie. But the catcher, the lineman and the mummy here are all occupying the 3 squares that the zombie can be pushed into. So what you have to do is work out who do you want to push back instead, and the humans here maybe would push back into the catcher. That becomes another diagonal. It means those 3 spaces are where the catcher can move to, and they decide that they want to move the catcher over here away from the mummy to protect it, for example. The other thing you could do is, let's say in the undead turn, the mummy is going to block the blitzer, but the 3 squares behind it are all occupied by the zombie, Ghoul and the Ogre, and they decide they want to push into the Ogre. Similarly, to protect the Ghoul from the Ogre, you don't want the Ghoul being hit by an Ogre, so the mummy pushes the blitzer that way. And that's the sort of 2 shapes where that will happen. If you've got like a square of players and you hit diagonally into one corner, or if you have a sort of T shape like this hitting on from a straight side. Now, For a lot of the time I've been playing Blood Bowl, I sort of saw chain pushes as like a sort of accidental circumstance where things get a bit crowded. But good Blood Bowl coaches, and like something I've been adding to my game of late, is to sort of look for or deliberately manufacture situations like this where you can use chain pushes to your advantage. And this can do all sorts of things. Like, so you can have something like we just had where they were looking to protect the ghoul or the catcher, by moving them into safer positions or moving dangerous players away. But you might be able to do something like move the opponent's ball carrier into a position where you can blitz them, or like move one of your players who hasn't acted yet this turn into a position that's dangerous to your opponent, because sort of a bit of free movement for a player activates can really make a big difference in the game. You can even like use chain pushes to sort of manoeuvre a player into a position where they can score right from a kickoff in one turn, because no one has the movement to cover half the pitch in one turn. Or not in the current edition, you can't anyway. But you can get a situation where you can start moving a player down the pitch without them having activated, and score in one turn. And I'm going to refer you elsewhere at this point for some further guidance. So I've got quite an old video now called The Art of Pushing Back, which I'm going to link below. And I'm also going to put in a link to a video by a Blood Bowl 2 streamer called Andy Davo, who I've learned a lot about chain pushing from. And sort of rather than trying to replicate that information, it's sort of a good idea to have a look at those separate resources. Like chain pushing is like an advanced technique though, or certainly using it strategically is. So it's something to sort of revisit when you've got to grips with the basics of the game and are looking to start improving. For now, you just sort of need to understand what to do if you get to the situation where you need to push a player back with a block and all the squares are filled in. It's that sort of what do we do situation. It's just further pushbacks, looking at the same angles, whether it's in a straight line or sort of diagonally. You can start thinking about it strategically later once you've learned how to play the game. Back in the last video on the move action, I mentioned that standing next to the touchline is dangerous. So if a player is pushed back off the pitch into the crowd, they're going to be at best out of the rest of the drive. And we're going to cover injuries in part 6 of this series, but a player pushed into the crowd is just going to take an injury roll, and their AV stat that we looked at in part 1 is no protection. And that puts them in a bad situation. So to push a player off the pitch, you need to sort of push them so that the only eligible squares for them to go to are sort of imaginary ones off the pitch. And on this particular screen, we have the grid still continuing to be marked out there, so it helps for this illustration. But the most straightforward way is to sort of be square with them, so that the 3 squares they can go to are all on the other side of the touchline. Like the zombie with the trapped lineman here. So the zombie can push its lineman. Any of those 3 squares off the pitch, the crowd will beat them up. If you're on a diagonal to the defender though, so like this, you have this square available to push them to. So you need to fill that gap with someone else first. So we could stick a ghoul in here, and that leaves these 2 spaces available, and you can push them into the crowd there. The final one, so if you're sort of side onto a player like this on the touchline, and you fill in these 2 squares, so we'll stick a skeleton in here, that leaves only this square that you can push back to, because these are both filled in. And then, yeah, you push them into the crowd in that third space. So go there instead. But the important thing to remember when you're trying to surf players is basically if there's a square on the pitch, the player has to be pushed there. They have to go there rather than in the crowd. As I'm sure you can imagine, there are ways to sort of combine chain pushes with surf. So if I was the human coach here, presented with this situation, this skeleton here would be a very tempting target. I could just fill in this to make myself a square, and then obviously the players aren't going to be like this, but then blitzing the skeleton from this space here means I can push back into the ghoul, push the ghoul off the pitch, and that's going to get rid of a ghoul for a drive. That'd be quite a tempting situation if you were given that. You just push the skeleton into the ghoul's gone. But like with chain pushes, you'll also find some more links below to other places with good guides on this area of the game as well. I do cover surfs a bit in the video The Art of Pushing Back, which I mentioned before. I'm also going to link in a video from a YouTube channel called Nuffle's Playbook about surfing, which really goes into depth on all the different ways to do it. It gives a more in-depth explanation to what I've just done up here. But it's well worth a look. It gives you things to look out for, and helps advise you on how to do it. But yeah, that's blocking. So it's probably one of the longer videos in this series, but it's one of the big fundamentals of the game. And like I said, it's got some of the most complicated mechanics. But next, we're going to look at a major part of the game that we've pretty much ignored up until now, which is actually the ball.